Welcome, everyone, to Treasure Box 2022 season. My name is Jack Wheeler, and I am the rail historian for Treasure Box Tours. We are so excited for this year's lineup, and in particular, I'm really excited for our rail tours. The one in Colorado is called On Top of the World in Colorado, because we really truly will be on top of the world, which you'll see here in a moment. Now, what I love about this tour is that it really mimics a Circle Line tour. I think of the bus tour that went to the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, to the Grand Lake Lodge, and then finally the Idaho Springs at the Indian Hot Springs back to Denver. That was in the 19 teens, 1920s. But our Circle Line tour is going to focus on railroads, of course, because my goodness, how could you not in this beautiful state of Colorado? And we're going to start by going south to Colorado Springs, or more specifically, Manitou Springs. We will enjoy our first night at the Cliff House. And not only will we be in this charming small town close to our first rail stop, we'll also be along the lines of the Colorado Midland Railroad. Along Highway 24, which we will travel on, we will be able to view in and around and just beyond Manitou Springs the tunnels that allowed the Colorado Midland to ascend this part of the mountains. The Colorado Midland was the very first standard gauge railroad in the state to cross the Continental Divide. One would think that would position the railroad for great success. Unfortunately, mismanagement of the railroad's operations would lead to its financial demise during World War I and eventual abandonment in 1921. You can see in the bottom right corner the tunnels, one of the many tunnels today, cut through the red sandstone of the canyon. Many of them are in great condition and are easily viewable from the highway. So even though we won't be riding trains on our first day, rail history will be all around us. On the second day, we will truly be on top of the world. From the picture on the bottom of your screen, you can clearly see why America the Beautiful was inspired by this vista. We will enjoy the Pikes Peak Cog Railroad, newly rebuilt, entirely new right-of-way from beginning to end, and a new visitor center at the top. One of the highlights of this is the 25% grade just before you get to the final ascent above Timberline. And in the past, I'm sure they will still do it. They'll announce, we're at the 25% grade, and if you don't know the person across from you, as the seats are 4 and 4 on either side facing each other, they say, well, you'll know that person now. It really isn't so stupid that you fall out of your seat, but it is something to behold. And it'll be such a delight to see this brand new visitor center and facilities for souvenirs and refreshments at the top. We'll then come back down to Manitou Springs to continue our journey west along Highway 24, which, remember, is indeed, for the entire length of the highway, all the way to Buena Vista, is the original Colorado Midland Railroad. But we will go south first to Cripple Creek. Pictured on the left is the old Colorado Midland Depot. Colorado Midland really focused on this area of Colorado, especially, of course, the gold mines. But there were several other railroads that would build to this area, and it was a huge boom town. We will ride the Cripple Creek and Victor Railroad, pictured on the right side of the screen. This flamboyant blue locomotive, number 2, is really unique to Colorado railroading because its career was never here until it was brought to operate on this special railroad. You might notice that the track is only 2 feet wide. The 2-foot gauge never operated commercially, steam locomotives that is, in the state. This locomotive had its career in Peru. And its sister locomotives also had their careers in South America before being brought in to operate this tourist railroad. And this is quite delightful because we will follow the original Colorado Midland Railroad, the right of way, not on the exact same equipment and not on standard gauge line, but on this charming 2-foot gauge railroad that will really bring us into the past of this mining town's golden age. Once we visit Cripple Creek, we'll continue west to the Arkansas River Valley. Now, the Arkansas River Valley had the Denver and Rio Grande, the Denver, South Park and Pacific, and the Colorado Midland Railroad. Now, the Denver and Rio Grande and the South Park and Pacific, they were the first to arrive in the valley, and therefore they had prime choice for the right-of-way. So when the Colorado Midland arrived, they had to build tunnels where nobody else had to build tunnels along the river right-of-way so that they could actually have their trains go north in the valley. Pictured on the right side of the screen are the Midland tunnels, and it is my great hope that we will be able to drive through them. Pictured here is my family's van. You can see the monumental size of them. In the same style as the tunnels near Manitou Springs, it was, of course, the same railroad and the same era. So improvements were not made to these tunnels like the Moffett line. The tunnels we know today on the Moffett line were all refurbished in the 19 teens up until the 1940s with cement portals. The raw rock portals, that's unique to these Midland tunnels. This is just about a mile north of Buena Vista. And again, this trip is so fun because we are following all of these old railroad right-of-ways. And as we experience the food, the sights, and all of the wonderful activities along the line, it is my hope that you all think about the people traveling in those passenger cars well over 100 years ago, what they thought, what they might have seen, smelled, experienced. We'll be doing that very same thing. Our accommodations in the Arkansas River Valley, Mount Princeton Hot Springs. And even this hot springs resides along the old right-of-way of the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific went from Denver through South Park via Fairplay, down Trout Creek Pass to Buena Vista, and then westward still along Chalk Creek, which you can see right here on the bottom picture, cutting through the Hot Springs Resort facility. And it would eventually pierce the Continental Divide through the Alpine Tunnel and reach Gunnison. Unfortunately, it was not able to secure the traffic needed to sustain itself and was abandoned in 1939. And in its last form, it was a part of the Colorado and Southern Railway system. And this resort, including the red historic bathhouse, was along the right-of-way of that railroad. Today, we will enjoy a private, adult-only side, which is pictured over here, across the creek from the historic bathhouse. The building is illuminated on the upper left photo. It has a general hot soaking pool, a cold dip pool, a very small ice dip pool, sauna, steam room, and cascading Japanese pools, as well as access to the pools along Chalk Creek. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the pools that form naturally along the creek bed and bank that allow one to enjoy the hot water in its most natural and unaltered form. On the historic bathhouse side, there are 2 additional soaking pools and an outdoor steam room, which is quite charming, especially on cold winter days. The resort sits next to the chalk cliffs, which are pictured here on the left side, the leftmost picture. And an on-site restaurant also provides wonderful fares. Now, I wanted to show you a picture of the right-of-way. On the left side of this picture is the old Denver, South Park, and Pacific right-of-way as it ascends to St. Elmo, which is right before the Alpine Tunnel. St. Elmo is very famous as it is truly a ghost town, and its population, I think, is some 150 chipmunks. I kid you not, chipmunks. But this is a delightful shot that I took hiking one year. Really shows the scale and the really challenging conditions that these railroads were built in. Keep in mind, it was at the end of the 19th century. After we enjoyed the rail history of the Arkansas River Valley and especially the hot springs, we'll venture north to Leadville. And here is, again, the intersection of the three railroads that we have been following. We've been following the Colorado Midland, the Denver South Park and Pacific, and the Rio Grande. Now, I briefly mentioned the Denver Rio Grande previously. However, at Leadville, it all comes together. Because all three of those railroads, their main objective was to reach Leadville to secure the majority traffic volume out of that city when it was the biggest city in the state. So the Denver South Park and Pacific, they had the claim to the right-of-way. They reached Buena Vista first. And that meant that they could build up the Arkansas River Valley and they were going to reach Leadville before the Denver Rio Grande. Well, John Gould, this Eastern industrialist, with the help of the Rio Grande, convinced the Denver South Park and Pacific to enter a joint operation agreement in which they shared the cost of the construction of the line to Leadville. However, they put in a clause in there that was not noticed by the Denver South Park and Pacific, and it essentially allowed them to kick the Denver South Park and Pacific off of the line. So, in a mad scramble, the Denver South Park and Pacific built the High Line from Como in the South Park Valley to Leadville through Climax. This line crossed the Continental Divide twice, and it was used up until very recently as a freight railroad for the molybdenum mine up in Climax, which is why we get to enjoy a standard gauge railroad and probably some of the tightest curves one will ever experience on a standard gauge railroad, as the right-of-way was originally for narrow gauge, but it was expanded to standard gauge during this line's operation as a part of the Denver and Rio Grande system in the late 20th century. But this ride from Leadville up to the headwaters of the Arkansas is spectacular. With outdoor open seating, one concession car, and plenty of views. This about 2-hour round trip ends with a stop at one of the last remaining water tanks, the water towers, where passengers are allowed to get out, stretch, take pictures, get back on, and descend back into Leadville. So, this tour with 3 different train rides follows the history of 3 prominent railroads in Colorado, and their history is written on the landscape. We'll be able to not only see it, but interact with it, perhaps even drive through it, and enjoy the natural beauty of the area, from the vistas of Pikes Peak to the soothing, healing waters of Mount Princeton Hot Springs. This tour really highlights some of the best that Colorado has to offer, not only in the natural beauty, but also in the beauty of the human history, and in particular, the beauty of the railroads. And it is our great hope that you will join us. Thank you very much for your time. I wish you all a very wonderful and safe winter and a new year. And may I see you in 2022 on one of our rail tours. Thank you very much.